Hello everyone, this is Ed Runkle, pastor at Tapestry Church, seen here weekly on LCTV channel 66, and you may see us live every Sunday morning at 10:30 at 22 Crady Avenue, and you're welcome here. Good morning everybody, I'm so glad you're with us this morning. To kind of set things up this morning, I want you to imagine for a moment what life would be like without a word. Imagine walking into a new school without a class schedule or a map or an idea where the cafeteria is located. Or imagine starting a new job where your boss or your manager doesn't explain the expectations of your role or how you can be successful. Or that on Fridays everyone wears sweatpants to the office. Or imagine moving to a new city and having no one tell you how to get around, how to find the supermarket to buy groceries, or a physician, or the dry cleaners. Or imagine life without a word. Now imagine life without a word from God. I mean, it would be aimless and purposeless and directionless and very, very lonely, wouldn't it? And yet, this is the reality that for lots of people. Not only because, there are lots of people who don't believe God has left us a word, but also because many of us who claim He has live as though He hasn't. I mean, think for a minute about how often you have questions and face decisions and find yourself constantly wondering about what God's will is in these questions and decisions. I mean, does anybody else ever have this experience? Have you ever made some version of the statement, I just wish God would tell me His will about, and you could, fill in the blank about, this decision I need to make or this move I need to make. What is God's will? Well, we're going to continue in the New Testament book of John, who is a gospel writer and like a biographer of Jesus. And continuing in the final chapter of John's gospel, we were there last week, and this is again a post-resurrection encounter and involving Peter. Beginning at verse 21 through verse 25, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. And this is supposed to be John, the writer of this gospel, the one who also had leaned back against him during the supper and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? And when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? And Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So the saying spread abroad among the brothers that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he is not to die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Well, here's the context for what I just read. As I mentioned last week, if you tuned in or were here, you may recall that Jesus was talking to Peter on the beach and that he had to clear up some unfinished business to kind of restore Peter from his massive failure. Well, and he asked Peter to follow him, which is kind of a basic, direction. But we often, that's what Jesus asks us, but we often try to complicate things, don't we? We worry, we compare, what about this other guy? We ask, we have a lot of what ifs. And Jesus simply says, follow me. There's so much, we don't know, so much we can never know, so much that is not ours to know. And, we have a hard time with that. We kind of want to know all the variables. We kind of want mechanical formulas and, shortcuts to the mind of God. And it's, a part of the kind of American fetish, part of it is freedom of choice, but part of it is personal success. And so we, want to make sure that our choices and decisions lead to the best possible outcomes. I wonder how many of us, live with the idea that God has a right turn and a wrong turn for us. And if we don't hear God's directions carefully or correctly, we'll end up in the wrong place for our lives. Well, the problem with that approach is that, first of all, it kind of focuses, on our getting things right in our lives rather than, on God's, relationship with God. And it also kind of makes God out to be sneaky. We're preoccupied with God's plans rather than with His character. And it binds us in chains of indecision and it makes us kind of passive. It's not just that we don't do anything, it's that we feel spiritual for not doing anything. You know what I mean? We imagine our inactivity as patience and sensitivity to God's leading. And, while at times, I suppose that's the case, it's often the case that what we actually do is hyper-spiritualize our decisions, which can cause us to veer off, can cause us to make impulsive and foolish choices, or probably more likely, just to fall into this kind of endless pattern of vacillation and indecision and regret. In fact, that's what it means to hyper-spiritualize our decision-making. It means we wait for just the right inspiration, just the right information that will cause us to, this decision that we need to make, to cause it to be easy, to cause it to be clear that the next step is so evident that we know exactly what to do. And sometimes we wait so long to decide that decisions are made for us by others or by circumstances. It reminds me, there's an old comic strip. If any of you are Charlie Brown fans, you may remember the Peanuts comic strips. And there's one for those of you who, like me, are in the AARP crowd. You may remember where Linus is watching television and Lucy walks into the room and demands that he change the channel. And Linus asks, "What gives you the right to watch whatever you want when I already had the television going?" And Lucy shows him her hand and says, "Do you see these 5 fingers? Individually, they're nothing, but when I clench them into a single unit, they form a weapon, terrible to behold." And so Linus changes the channel. He walks out of the room and looks down at his fingers and says, "Why can't you guys get organized like that?" See, when we hyper-spiritualize our decision-making, it's kind of like that. We can't get organized, can't get our act together and move forward, take a step forward. It's almost like we don't want the answers we claim to seek, because for one thing, the answers will force us to make a commitment or a choice and close off all the other options, which we don't like to do. And for another thing, it requires that we walk by faith. And for another thing, the answers may cause us to confront the fact that our plans and our lives aren't really lining up with God's revealed will. In either case, it's a lot more fun, to put on the face of angst and to sit around and discussing and diagnosing and pontificating and pondering and questioning, what is God's will for me in this? I know, God's made of love or is love or invented love, but I'm pretty confident that when He's up in heaven and He goes out running with Elijah or Elisha, I always forget which one He goes running with, but when he looks down and we're doing this, I think He just thinks, why do they do that? I hate when they do that. It's like, it's hard for us if we don't see the entire path laid out ahead. It's hard for us to, take a step, to take a next step. We want to know the answers to the questions, and we want to know in advance. In the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel, in chapter 3, there's an interesting situation with David, the same David who killed the Philistine giant Goliath. And he and his men are hiding from Saul when they hear that the Philistines are attacking a town called Keilah. And against the wishes of his men, David leads his army into Keilah to defeat the Philistines. So Saul figures that with David and his men tired from the battle and kind of trapped inside the walls of this town, that this is the perfect time for him to attack. And David learns of Saul's plan, and he cries out, "O Lord, O God of Israel, your servant has heard that Saul plans to come here and destroy the town on account of me. Will the citizens of this town surrender me to him? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, tell your servant." I mean, sometimes I feel guilty about asking God specific questions, but David is pretty detailed here. And God's answer to the question, will Saul come down, is he will. And the verse continues, again David asks, will the citizens of this town surrender me and my men to Saul? And God's answer is, they will. Now forget for a moment that certain death is marching toward David. Forget that the people he's just saved are going to turn him over as soon as Saul arrives. And at this point in the story, there are 600 adrenaline-drunk, battle-beaten men trapped inside the walls of a city that's not their own. The streets are littered with the dead. The doors and the windows of every home are shut. And David reaches out to God for a message about how to respond. Surely God has some deep, detailed thoughts about this situation. Surely God has instructions for David, but all God does to break the silence is give David 4 words: he will, they will. I mean, so often I demand more words from God just to motivate myself to get out of bed in the morning. But David, all he had, just 4 words. And, he needed to convince 600 men that they needed to, move out in order to avoid being attacked. Have you ever tried to motivate six people to choose a restaurant for dinner? But here's what's, striking in this text. Verse 12 ends, and the Lord said they will. Verse 13 begins, so David and his men, about 600 in number, left Keilah and kept moving from place to place. Where was the analysis between verses 12 and 13? Where was the wrestling over this decision and checking in the months of prayer? There wasn't any. In the space of a verse, David left, and in doing so, saved the lives of his men and the entire city for the second time. I don't know, but maybe the next time you find yourself asking God for detailed instructions about what you should do, you should instead ask Him for the wisdom to hear the 4 words He does give you and the courage to act on them. I know that's what I need to do. I need to ask God to align my life with what He's already revealed. To put what I'm trying to get at another way, maybe what we should be looking for is not guidance, but rather we should be looking at how to become individuals or a people God can guide. Maybe we should be looking for wisdom rather than guidance. Guidance implies there's a right turn and a wrong turn for me. Wisdom implies God will refine me, change me, teach me, and help me make good decisions according to His Word. When it comes to most of our daily decisions, and even a lot of life's big decisions, the Bible doesn't give very specific guidance. The Bible doesn't even give very specific guidance on huge life-shaping decisions like, should I marry this person? Or should I give more or save for retirement? Or should we adopt a child? Or should I pursue a different vocation? Should we homeschool? Or should I pursue chemo or try an alternative cancer treatment? Should we buy this home or a less expensive one? And maybe the reason God doesn't always tell us what to do in the details is because He's doing what He does in so many areas of life. He's developing intimacy with us. He's forcing us to, talk and listen, to even argue sometimes, but to know Him rather than just His plan. His ultimate concern isn't to get us from point A to point B along the quickest, easiest, smoothest, clearest route possible. Instead, His ultimate concern is that you and I would know Him more deeply as we trust Him more completely. Let me ask you, do you trust God? Are you confident that He's already determined how to fit your choices into His sovereign will, whatever they are? Just follow me, is what Jesus says to Peter. What does it mean to follow Him? Well, let's look at a few clues from a previous conversation Jesus has with Peter. As I mentioned the other week, Peter, John, these resurrection appearances of Jesus with Peter and John and 5 others, they occur after Peter decided to go back fishing. Well, after a night in which he and the others, caught nothing, Jesus is standing on the beach and shouts instructions to Peter to cast his net on the other side of the boat. Now, in that first encounter, I can just imagine Peter saying, really? Jesus says, let's go out into the deeper water. Let's let our nets down for a catch. And Peter must be thinking, okay, that sounds really nice, but why don't you stick with the carpentry and we'll stick with the fishing, because you obviously have no idea what you're talking about. This is not the time to catch fish. And I can imagine Peter feeling a bit flustered, that he's on the beach cleaning nets. Jesus asked Peter to do something that he'd done many times before. Draw this boat into the water, let down the nets. What's different is that Jesus is asking Peter to try it Jesus' way. Something he's done 1,000 times before, but this time, let's do it my way. There's no extraordinary, world-changing task. Jesus doesn't ask Peter to perform something out of the usual. He's not asking him to move to another country, not asking him to give up and leave it all behind at this point. Just do something you do every day. But this time, how about trying it my way? See, at this stage of following Jesus, it kind of boils down to one question. Will you trust Him enough to do something you've done lots of times, but to start trying it His way? You're already in these relationships. You do this all the time. You make these choices all the time. Jesus says, I want you to go right where you go, right where you are, right into your day-to-day life, and we're going to run some experiments, and I want you to try it my way. See, Jesus wants you to know who He is, wants you to understand what He can do. He doesn't just ask you to start following Him by leaving everything behind. He says, let's go into your life. Let's go into the fishing world. I want you to see what I can do. Here's what I'm trying to get at. Following Jesus is more than stringing together a series of common everyday choices in particular situations. It's more about that than it is about some earth-shattering moment of clarity. One of the ways we tend to complicate following Jesus is we look for the great revelation, where Jesus is often asking us to take a next step that isn't so spectacular, something simple. Maybe it's apologizing to a loved one, or extending forgiveness, or making the next smart financial decision, or exercising patience. I mean, a lot of us need to forget about God's will for our lives in terms of some great revelation. God cares more about our response to His Spirit's leading today, in this moment, than what we intend to do next year. In fact, the decisions we make next year will profoundly be affected by the degree to which we submit to His Spirit right now in today's decisions. It's like, we're one choice closer. It's like a cookie is one choice further away from your fitness goal. Or it's like, I'll call her later is one choice further away from a relationship goal. And so it's these little choices that over time have a big impact. As they say at Home Depot, let's do it. I mean, let's experiment this week by inviting Jesus along into something we may have done 1,000 times, some ordinary part of our life, but let's see if we can do it His way. I mean, it's interesting. Maybe you've seen this. There have been articles lately about the U.S., one in particular in the New York Times was titled "The United States of Metrics," and the premise of the article is about this advent of smart technology and how it's allowed us to quantify things that we couldn't quantify before, from the steps, how many we take per day, to the friends we have, to the size of our carbon footprint. And so we're awash in numbers, and the data is everywhere. And the number one paid for app on iTunes, I think this was last spring, was the sleep cycle alarm clock, which monitors the amount and quality of winks you get and wakes you up during a light phase of your sleep cycle. A big top seller. There are even there's smart cutlery. Something called the Happy Fork tracks how fast you eat. If you don't pause 10 seconds between each bite, the utensil turns bright red and vibrates to slow you down. It's not like, I don't know if anybody has one of those. I could probably use one of those if you've seen me eat. I eat way too fast. But the issue is Big Brother isn't the enemy anymore. It's Big Self, that hovering eye in the sky watching every move you make. It's you. And see, that's part of the problem when it comes to decision making. When our focus is on ourselves or on each other, we begin to compare and compete, like Peter and John in what we read earlier, which leads us not only to make unhealthy and unwise decisions, but can lead us into a black hole. I mean, looking to Jesus reminds us that we have nothing that we haven't received through Him. Looking to Jesus reminds us that loving and serving each other, just as He loved and served us, is the path to full joy. In other words, a pathway to freedom from the slavery of selfish ambition and to wise decision-making is to keep looking at Jesus. I don't know if you noticed in what I read earlier that Jesus talked about how when Peter becomes old, he'll stretch out his hands and someone else will dress him and carry him to where he doesn't want to go. Well, Jesus isn't saying that Peter's, going to find himself in a nursing home and needs somebody else to take care of him. But rather, as the first century historian Josephus puts it, that's what people did when they were going to be crucified. They stretched out their hands and were tied to the crossbeam and then had to carry the crossbeam to the place of execution. You will stretch out your hands and someone will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go. In other words, the person Peter denied and who was subsequently killed comes back from the grave, and one of the first things he tells Peter is, you're going to die. And it wasn't, like nudge, nudge, wink, wink here from Jesus. Part of what he was getting at is that following Jesus, pursuing God's will, that's not always going to be easy. And sometimes, it is more than, just inviting, God into what we're doing and doing it His way. Sometimes, if you become convinced, for instance, that Jesus was asking you to, would you move your family to a different school district, let's say, even at just the wrong moment for your kids' schooling? Or would you stay in an inner city and send your kids to a school with a questionable reputation if you knew that's what God wanted you to do? Or to leave maybe the area where your parents are reaching a point of needing more help and care if you knew that's what God wants you to do? I mean, does what God want for you matter more than these other things? Is He worth the inconvenience or the sacrifice? Do you trust Him enough for your family? I mean, we all make decisions based on what we really love. And if what we really love deep down is the world, that will become apparent. Patterns of decisions that we make, they'll kind of conform to the world. But if we really love Jesus, increasingly what He loves will be what we love, and we'll be transformed by that. Our love for Him and His kingdom will be revealed in the pattern of small and large choices that we make. And I say pattern because, we all make mistakes, but overall the conformity will either be to the world or to Jesus, and that will be seen in the pattern. It's kind of like, I don't know, some of you who are dog people may know that they're, sometimes when dogs are meeting others, they get down in front and their rear end sticks up. I don't know if you know what that's called, but that's called the play bow. It means the dog wants to play, or sometimes if a dog bites another dog, it's to communicate I didn't really mean it, or if they do something out of hand that I'm sorry. Well, I think, our decisions will kind of bow toward God as we are drawn by God's love, that they'll bow in that direction rather than in the world's direction. And the thing, that we need to remember in all of this is that every decision we make, Christ never made a decision, consciously or unconsciously, that wasn't completely consistent with loving His Father and His neighbor. And there's some debate about Jesus' age when He was crucified, if He lived to be 33 and a half years old. There were 1,057,157,021 seconds in that. And every second, the average human being's brain has 100 billion neurons, all firing 200 times per second, giving a capacity for 20 million billion firings per second. If we want to know how many conscious decisions Jesus made to obey His Father's will, multiply 20 million billion by the number of seconds He lived, and the equation would be huge, a very large number. During His lifetime of constant, unwavering obedience from infancy all the way to death, Jesus wove a robe of righteousness sufficient to cover every single defective decision you and I have made or will ever make. So in the end, we're covered by Jesus, for heaven's sake. Thank you for joining us at Tapestry Church this morning. We hope you enjoyed the message. For more information, you may check out our website or Facebook page, and you may see us live weekly at 22 Crady Avenue at 10:30. All are welcome.